are going to go ahead and get started. Now, I will let you know I am also my own tech support tonight, so I'll be admitting a few more folks in as I do a little intro here, making sure that people get in from that waiting room. So a couple of quick notes. I will ask that you, at least for now, stay muted. Definitely use that chat feature for any questions. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. But before we get to that, I do just want to do a little bit of an introduction. My name is Abby. I am the Director of Education Services here at the Durham Museum, and I have the pleasure of getting to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of the exhibit that really inspired this presentation tonight. So raise your hand. Have any of you gotten to come see the guitar exhibit yet? Maybe just a few. So those of you that have, hope you loved it. The exhibit is called Guitar, the instrument that rocked the world. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But first, I do want to thank the sponsors who helped us bring the exhibit here to the Durham. And those include the Richard Brooke Foundation, Mutual of Omaha, the Lori and David Scott Foundation, Douglas County, Susan and George Haddix, and media support by KETV. So normally we do a big round of applause here in the lecture hall, but since we're virtual, just join me in thanking them, please. This exhibit, as you can see, I'm standing here in the exhibit, so I'm all by myself at the museum tonight, which is always interesting. The exhibit is called Guitar, the instrument that rocked the world. Again, not a virtual background. I know we're all used to seeing those, but I am actually here in the exhibit. The exhibit is visiting us from the National Guitar Museum, which is located in New York. And I actually had the pleasure of getting to visit with their executive director, whose name is H.P. Newquist, when he came to install the exhibit. And it was very inspirational for me. I'm a music lover, but it was still really neat to hear specifically about kind of his perspective on why this exhibit was so important. And I know our guest speaker tonight will certainly touch on that. But one thing I wanted to share with you that he shared with me is that there are more guitars sold every year than all other instruments combined. And also that the year 2020 was actually record setting for guitar sales due to the pandemic and people wanting to learn a new hobby. So I thought that was really interesting, and it definitely gave a new perspective to the exhibit as well. And then, like I said, just a brief technical note to make sure that folks heard, especially because I know some folks are just joining us. So I will ask that you stay muted. You can choose if you want to turn your video on or off, but I will spotlight our guest speakers video so you can make sure that you're seeing that. And that being said, if you haven't done one of these before, I would recommend you do what's called presenter mode. In the top right corner of your Zoom screen, there's a button that says view. And you can either choose speaker view or gallery view. I would recommend speaker view. And throughout the exhibit, I will turn my video, or throughout the presentation, I will turn my video back on to show you a few of the instruments that are here at the Durham, in case you can come see those. So that is the plan technology-wise for tonight. I'm just going to let a few more folks in here. We have an awesome group tonight. So now it is my immense pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Kenneth Bae has been performing lute music since 1974 and has been taught and worked with many notable players. His repertoire for early plucked musical instruments spans from the earliest known lutes of the late 15th century to really the peak of lute music in the late 18th century, plus surviving music of other instruments that we'll be showing here as well tonight. Kenneth is originally from the Hudson Valley region north of New York City, and has worked as a painting conservator at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and more recently is currently a conservator at Omaha's own Ford Conservation Center. He's been there since 2008. So go ahead and give a big virtual welcome to our special guest for tonight, Mr. Kenneth Bae, and I will let him take over.
Yes, hello. And I'm delighted to be here tonight to introduce you to the long and sometimes unclear and sometimes complicated history of the guitar, this instrument that we all love so much. I am going to share bits of PowerPoint and about maybe 7 or 8 instruments that I'll play for you. And somehow we'll get through 500 years in less than an hour. Just one moment here. Okay. So on to the next slide, please. We're going to trace the history of the guitar, the different forms of instruments, the instruments that we think are guitars, but may not actually be guitars, instruments that are related to the evolution of the guitar. And all of this comes from the past, and it's based on evidence we have from iconography. Iconography would be paintings, sculpture, written accounts like descriptions, manuscript descriptions, printed descriptions, treatises. Those are instructions that talk about actually about the instruments and how to play them. And those are often related to the music itself, the musical sources. We go back and forth between the music and trying to understand how people talked about it. And then finally, we have surviving instruments, and we relate that as well to the music and how we could have interpreted the music based on instruments. Obviously, going way back in time, we have fewer and fewer examples. I think the earliest actual instruments we have go back to about the 14th century. And even so, we only have a handful of plucked instruments from that time. So on to the next slide. I will show you maybe the first images of what we can call something that's guitar-like. And these are these oblong instruments called kitharas that are from the 8th century. That would be the Carolingian period, the period of Charlemagne. And these are these large handheld instruments you can see with a neck and plucked, usually with a plectrum. But the first example we have of an instrument that we begin to think is guitar-like would be in the next slide. And here we have mid-13th century Contiguous of Santa Maria. This is a collection of over 400 songs that are devotional to the Virgin Mary. And the Escorial version of this manuscript has numerous beautiful colored pairs of instrument players in these little miniatures. The instruments you see to the right of the left photo and in the left of the right photo are, in fact, what we call guitarra latinas. They are wasted in shape, that is, they have an incurved side that we begin to recognize as guitar-like. And then that is in contrast to the instrument at the far right, which is a guitarra morisca, which has Moorish origins. And then the instrument on the left is a bowed fiddle or vielle. If we switch off the PowerPoint for a moment, I will show you my example of a guitarra latina. And I'm going to play for you a song from the Contiguous of Santa Maria from the mid-13th century. Santa Maria Strella do Dia. In the next PowerPoint slide, you will see, if we come back to the PowerPoint, another instrument which we call the gittern. This is confusing because gittern and guitar are sort of the same root of the word, and we find them interchangeably in manuscripts of this time. But this instrument is clearly sort of teardrop shaped, and you can see it's also plucked with a plectrum. It has that sickle-shaped peg box, often with a carving at the top. I'm going to show you the gittern because it is so important in the Middle Ages, and I think has a relationship with the development of the guitar and the guitar repertoire at this time. By the way, music that I'm playing was not actually written for these instruments. We have to go by conjecture that they were used for accompaniment and for solos with popular music and dances that was that's prevalent at this time. I'm going to show you the next slide. Shows the two surviving gitterns we have. These are the earliest plucked instruments from Europe. The upper one is a gittern. Believe it or not, it was found in an archaeological latrine. Someone threw it down the toilet sometime in the 14th or early 15th century. And then about maybe 20 years ago, it was unearthed in the town of Elbląg near Gdansk in Poland. And there we have it. The lower instrument is a much finer instrument and survives from the mid-15th century and is still preserved in Germany. I have a replica of that lower instrument, and you can see it if you turn off the PowerPoint, is my copy of the Hans Ott gittern. There was one more picture I want to show you in the PowerPoint. We'll go back to the PowerPoint, to the next slide. And that is the instrument. This instrument was carved from a single block of wood. Now that is important because you can see it has a round back, or you will see it has a round back when I come back to my instrument. And the early guitars, like the Guitarra Latina, have a flat back. But believe it or not, this instrument that you're going to hear in a moment comes from that single block of wood on the left, and that's during construction on the right, where it was hollowed out like a spoon. Okay, back to me. I'm going to play you a piece from mid-15th century Germany from around the time of the Hans Ott gittern called Mit ganzem Willen. You can hear that it has a lot more punch to the sound compared to the other one. That's partly because of the pressure bridge that it has, like a violin bridge. And here's that carved back that I was telling you about. Up till now, these instruments were plucked with plectrum, a pick like this. And in the late 15th century, they started using the fingers individually so they could pluck many different notes at the same time and play polyphony. One of the most important instruments that is not a guitar, but is very important to the history of the guitar because it was the prevalent instrument that had a lot of solo repertoire and was used for a lot of music making at this time, was the lute. And I'm going to show you a lute. Here, which is round, and most importantly, has a round back built with staves. Now you can look at the next PowerPoint slide. And here we have examples of a lute from the 15th century on the left and a lute from the 16th century on the right in these paintings. Let's see the next slide, please. The music from this time comes down to us in handwriting and in printed form in what we call tablature. Those lines that look like musical staves are not staves at all, but are representations of the strings of the lute. The bottom line is the top sounding string of the lute, and the top line is the bottom sounding string. So it's as if I'm looking into a mirror at the strings of a lute. And the zeros are open strings, and each number represents a consecutively higher fret. And this is what we call lute tablature. It's believed that we have perhaps up to 50 or 60,000 lute pieces between the early Renaissance and the Baroque, the high Baroque period that survive for the lute. And it's all in some type of tablature, either like this or a variant of it. The next page shows a modern transcription that shows a lute tablature on the top and the corresponding musical notes. I'm going to play this very short repertoire by the composer Francesco da Milano, and we can turn off the slide right now so I can play this for you. I forgot to mention that Abby is standing by to show you some examples of these instruments. We have a lute here. So here we are live in the exhibit, and you can see an example of a lute up close. We also have nearby a vihuela. You don't have to show these right now. We have a Baroque guitar, we have a 19th century guitar, and other instruments that are related to what I will be talking about. So here we are in the exhibit itself. Okay, back to my PowerPoint, please. And the next slide. Now we come to a little confusing part of history, but one which definitely deserves some attention. And that is the relationship between the bowed instruments and the plucked instruments. Here we see instruments that are bowed that look like they could be plucked, and instruments that are plucked that look like they could be bowed instruments. And that's because they are one and the same family of what we call vihuelas or violas. Viola, vihuela. They're very sort of interchangeable terms. And the bowed vihuela or the viola d'arco, the bowed vihuela is okay, we're going to come back to me again. Is an instrument like this. I'm not going to play it for you because that's not the point, to play you bowed instruments, but from about the same time period, we have these instruments that are called vihuelas. And we know they were very, very popular in Spain during the late 15th and throughout the 16th century. And this is the instrument that really dominated Spain and took the place of the lute in the Spanish repertoire, and becomes very important in the development of the what we eventually call the guitar. This is the Vihuela. I'm going to play, for those of you who are classical guitarists out there, you may recognize this very well-known Spanish Renaissance piece by Alonso Mudara, the fantasy that imitates a harp. And I'll play you this piece from 1548 by Alonso Mudara. So as you can see, I'm plucking with the fingers. I'm no longer using that quill that I was using earlier in the program, because we are now in the 16th century. And not only that, but music has now reached a point where it is published and it becomes widely available, and it's accessible to most everybody in the public that can afford such instruments and music. One other thing that I should mention is that none of these instruments just suddenly stopped and then got taken over by the next instrument. We have overlaps for sure between all the instruments that I've been showing you as they continued into use and other instruments came into fashion. We have a gradual sort of dominance of new forms of the guitar. Let's move to the next slide, please. Actually, this is the slide I meant to show you before I played that piece, but it's okay. It shows you the only surviving complete vihuela we have in existence. It's in Paris, and it's a very ornate instrument. and a very large instrument. And then here we have a bookplate frontispiece from Louis Milan's 1538 El Maestro, which is his publication of Vihuela music, an instrument that mine is very much a copy of. Let's go to the next one, please. There was a description in the 16th century that if you took off the top set of strings, by the way, when we have pairs of strings, we call those courses. So if we have a 6-course vihuela and we take the top course and the bottom course off, we have the 4 courses left in between. And what we have there from this description in the early 16th century is, in fact, a guitar. That's the first mention of a guitar proper. And now, from our vantage point, we call this the Renaissance guitar. The Renaissance guitar became highly popular, especially in France in the mid-16th century. And we have a series of very important books of repertoire, these books of chansons, gallards, and pavanes, dances, and songs for the guitar, with this beautiful cover illustration that is so detailed that, in fact, I have a copy of that very instrument. So look closely at that picture you see on your screen. And when Abby switches off the PowerPoint, you will see a replica of that instrument. It's small. In fact, it's so small that it traveled easily all around the world. It went with the sailors, the missionaries, the travelers to other countries, other continents in the 16th century, all around the world. And especially the Jesuit priests took them to places like Hawaii and to South America. And we ended up having instruments that stayed there like living fossils. Like in Hawaii, we have the ukulele. And in Mexico, we have the charango. And we have examples of these instruments in the exhibit. I think we can switch there. There's one, a charango made out of an armadillo carapace. And then around the corner, we have examples of ukuleles. Oh, above it, right there. Okay, that's great. Now, I'm going to play you an example on the Renaissance guitar. And the first thing you'll notice is that it lacks bass strings altogether, like a ukulele. And I'm going to play you a piece from the early years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, a pavane or a pasamezzo and a galliard, from a manuscript now at Yale University known as the Osborne Commonplace Book. The next stage in the guitar we have and by the way, I've been jumping almost 100 years with each example that I've been playing. But the next stage in the next show, there's an example of the tablature, which I read from when I play 16th century French guitar music. And the next slide. The next development is the 5-course, that is 5 pairs of strings instrument that we now call the Baroque guitar. Here's an example from 1640 from Italy, from Venice. I want you all to notice the word Vermilion, South Dakota. That means this instrument is in a museum that's only 2 hours to the north of us here in Omaha. This beautiful instrument. You notice it has a round back, it has ivory, bone inlay, ebony, and a beautiful ornate rose design. The Baroque guitar took over by force in Europe and was used for solo music and for accompaniment. This was the great age when we have the development of continuo accompaniment, that is groupings of instruments that accompanied the other solo instruments as a sort of a pickup band. Here's a Baroque guitar you can see in the exhibit. And if we go to the next slide in my PowerPoint, we will see some other examples in paintings. This is a very well-known painting by the artist Johannes Vermeer, showing a French 17th century guitar, probably by the firm called Vauban. The next slide. A well-known painting by Antoine Watteau, and it shows a theater figure who's strumming a guitar. You can see these instruments are very elegant, both the way they're held and the fashion in which they're fingered. Okay, the next picture. Here are 2 gentlemen who are very well known for their fondness for playing the guitar that we call now the Baroque guitar. Louis XIV actually had a guitarist who played in the evenings and mornings for him and taught him. When he wasn't handling the affairs of state, he was busy playing the guitar. And Charles II, who took refuge in the court of Versailles during when the royalty was overthrown during the time of Cromwell, spent time learning the guitar and the love of the guitar in the French court, and then brought that instrument back to England during the Restoration period, where in both France and in England, it took over with a rage at that time. Now, the next picture shows the way the Baroque guitar was handled. It was held in a way that you could strum the instrument close to the neck and body join in a strumming technique. The next slide actually shows these tablatures, these notations that show the way of strumming the chords. I'm going to, without changing this from the slide, I'm going to play this piece for you. This upper diagram is a facsimile of what we call alphabeto notation, where the chords are not actually the notes that I'm playing, but they're just commonly fingered chords that are understood to be certain fingerings. And the little tick marks up and down on the line show whether we play a down strum or an up strum. So I'm going to play just the top line so you can get an idea of what it sounds like. And just use your ears to listen. I'll show you the guitar in a moment. So that was the monica prima you see in the upper left. And then in the lower section, you see a chaconne by the great composer Francesco Corbetta. And that uses a combination of these large capital letters and the little number tabulations like you saw in the lute music earlier, which we call tablature. And this mixture of alphabet letters and little numbers and tick marks for strumming is called the mixed alphabeto style of notation. We'll go back to me again, and I'll show you my Baroque guitar. Here's a copy of an instrument that's very close in time to that instrument that you see in Vermilion, South Dakota. And it too has a round back. There's an example of this as well in the exhibition, which I think we just saw. And I want you to see the beautiful rose design, which is layers of cut parchment that are layered in a deep well of ornament that we call an inverted wedding cake ornament. I'm going to play this chaconne by the composer Francesco Corbetta, which uses a combination of strumming and plucking style. I want to point out that the tuning of the guitar is somewhat like the modern guitar for the top three strings. But then the D string is up an octave and the A string is up an octave. So here. And this allows the instrument to stay in the mid-range of the instrument, lacking basses, it stays in sort of a mid-range, and it allows notes to overlap in what we call a campanella style, so that we have. So it's like a bell-like campanella style. I'm going to play a well-known piece by Gaspar Sanz called the Canarios. Actually, we have time that I can play the Pavanos and the Canarios by the well-known Spanish composer from 1697 known as Gaspar Sanz. Let's see what I have on the next slide. Yes, that's the piece I just played. That's the Canarios of Gaspar Sanz from 1697. And then the next slide. Now we come to the beginning of the guitar as we know it, which is the late 18th century. In the third quarter of the 18th century, the instrument evolved from what I'm holding in my hand, which was the Baroque guitar with 5 pairs of strings and no bass strings, to an instrument that has bass strings and has 6 single strings. It was found to be easier to play and could handle the more complex changes of harmony and fast-moving passages, and was a perfect instrument for the amateur. I'm going to show you one more thing, which I hadn't planned on, but I'm going to show it to you now. By this point, the lute had evolved into something much more complex than what I played earlier this evening, where I played an instrument that had 6 courses or 6 pairs of strings. It had evolved into an instrument in the time of Bach, into an instrument that had some 13 sets of strings, 13 courses, and was so complicated it had to have 3 peg boxes. If I stand back, you can see it here. This instrument, needless to say, was much more difficult for the amateur to handle and was in the hands of professional lute players, and certainly was difficult and demanding to maintain. It was much easier to handle the guitar that had just 6 strings. Here I have in my hands a 19th century guitar. We have some examples in the exhibit as well. And from this instrument, it's pretty much a straight line to evolve into the modern guitar. And for contrast, I'm going to show you a modern classical guitar held in my right hand compared to this little 19th century guitar. It's much heavier to hold and has a much louder sound. I'm going to go backwards now. I'm going to play a little bit of this next piece by Fernando Soare, an etude. Fernando Soare is a contemporary of Beethoven. And I'm going to play it on the modern guitar just for a few measures so you can get that sound in your head before I switch to the 19th century guitar. And now the antique 19th century guitar. And to close my program, let's go to the last picture. And this is just to show you that the guitar had truly reached the hands of the amateur players and had moved far away from the early instruments I showed you from 500 years ago, which were largely in the hands of the professional musician. It was really the advent of printing in the beginning of the 16th century that brought music out into the households of the everyday person. And then finally, the six-string guitar, which continues today. As we said, in the pandemic period, we're all buying guitars and we can all play this instrument. So I hope you get to see the exhibit yourself. It's worth, I've seen it myself, and I can tell you it's worth making the trip over when it's safe to do so. I'm going to finish with an andantino by Fernando Carulli. Beautiful piece to wish you all a good night.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Abby Jung. I'm the Director of Education Services at the Durham Museum, and we are back with Kenneth Bae. We had an amazing time with you the other night, Kenneth, with your 500 Years of the Guitar talk and performance. And we had so many good questions that we wanted to do kind of this separate Q&A session. So I will jump right in with a great kind of introductory question, which is early in your performance and in your talk, Lee asked when we introduced you, where in the Hudson Valley are you from? He is from Warwick, New York. Is that nearby?
It is. It's just to the northwest of where I grew up in Rockland County in the town of Tappan. And for those of you who don't know that area, it's a very ancient Dutch colonial part of the United States from the early, in the 17th century. And my town, located on the Hudson River, is roughly halfway between Manhattan and West Point Military Academy, in order to place it. Beautiful part of the country. I recommend it to everybody.
Wonderful. This was not mentioned in the chat, but now I'm curious. So what did bring you to Omaha?
I came because of the work. As you mentioned, I work at the Ford Conservation Center here in Omaha, where I treat paintings for conservation, and that's what brought me here. I would have, before then, I would have told you Omaha was this place of Mutual of Omaha, which sponsored the Wild Kingdom when I was a kid growing up. So that dates me.
Wonderful. So, well, we're happy to have you. So these questions will kind of be in the order. So I guess I will say for viewers watching this, if you are watching this and you haven't seen the recording of the actual talk from Tuesday night, we would recommend you check that out. But also from Lee, in reference to the first instrument that you showed, he mentioned that there was a lot of sound coming from it. And he asked how many strings on that first instrument and what were the strings made of?
Wonderful question. Yes. Well, first of all, a lot of sound because that instrument has what we call a pressure bridge, kind of like a violin. The strings go well over from the top of the peg box down to the bottom of the instrument, and they press down on a bridge that is a pressure bridge, not a glued-on bridge. And those instruments tend to be louder. Think banjo, for example. And those particular strings were actually nylon, sort of replicas of lute strings. I'll talk a little bit more about strings later on if there's a chance. But one important thing is that instrument was fitted with drones, with strings that I could just play continuously as not as fixed notes on the bottom while I was playing the melody. And a drone instrument always has sort of an amplification of sound. Not only that, but one string was a drone, an octave or two down from the melody, and then there was a fifth above that. So that always sort of enhances the sound of the instrument. By the way, we don't really know how instruments of that time in the 13th century were tuned for that particular purpose. We do know that there was a lot of flexibility, and musicians, just like in the folk traditions today, probably retuned their instruments according to the musical need of the time.
Interesting. So that kind of leads to the next question we had pop up in the chat, which you just answered, but do we know how they were tuned? Or are we making good guesses? I liked how Tim asked that question.
Sure. Okay, and I'm going to ask that you go to the PowerPoint. Maybe I'll go back to the PowerPoint now, and I'll talk over it. I can answer a strings question and the tuning question all at once. So here we go. Good. Okay, so I think Lee had asked a question about how were the strings made, or what were they made of? And here we have gut on the left. You can see very clearly it has that rawhide look to it. And here you see a string maker literally pulling out the soaked intestines out of buckets and bowls and sorting them out. And eventually those get stretched while they're wet on these long winding or twisting machines and made into fine ropes. And these companies or these craftsmen who have revived the art of gut string making are so exact that they can make it down to the nearest 1/100th of a millimeter in diameter. And I actually buy my strings according to exact diameter specifications. How are these instruments tuned? Well, okay, one more thing. Let's keep going on with strings, and I'll get to the tuning in a moment. Next image shows another option we have, fortunately, in the year 2021. This company, in fact, that same man who you saw pulling the gut out of the buckets in that previous picture, his company also makes what they call Nile gut, or in the lute world, we call it new Nile gut, which is an even improved variety of nylon that has the density, the texture, and the acoustical properties of gut, so much so that at a certain distance away, you can almost not hear the difference between gut or not, and the player can't even feel the difference. These are great. They last forever. And so in this day of age where I'm doing so much playing, gut strings are so expensive that these Nile guts are the answer. But since I also love the warm sound and the feel of original gut, I have a number of instruments that are completely fitted with gut as well. For the bass strings, I use this sort of twisted copper metal over gut, and it actually has an approximation to the sound of gut when I play them in a certain careful way. Again, they're very, very durable and they're very stable. So I often fluctuate between a preference for a real gut or overspun. Now that question about tuning, I played at least these 6 or 7 instruments the other evening. Maybe I even counted 8. I don't remember. I lost count after a while. But here in this order, the Guitarra Latina, I talked about that tuning with the drone in the 5th. The guitar, which was that very punchy sounding second instrument I played, I actually tuned it exactly the way this treatise writer named Tinctoris spelled it out in 1481. And if you see that diagram in the upper right, That is from, what is it again, 1361, a manuscript that in the text specifically tells you what notes to tune the guitar to. I have my guitar tuned according to those mid-14th century instructions. The lute that I played is tuned like you see in the double staff. And the vihuela is identical to the lute, except that the bass strings are in unison and not octaves. The reason why you see pairs of notes going down that scale is because don't forget that my lute has pairs of strings called courses. The top one always being single, and then the ones following down are in unison down to a point, and then they break into octaves. Because when they started experimenting with these double stringings, they found that having the octave gave a certain sonority and a brightness to the instrument that gets lost if you have unisons. Now, that being said, the Spanish were well known for tuning the vihuelas in unison. One other quick thing, that top note, you see that G in the left-hand side of that staff, that is a note that we often tune lutes and vihuelas to. Actually, it's dependent on the length of the instrument and the diameter of the string you put on. So the real instructions they gave back in the Renaissance and earlier was put a thin gut string on and tune it as high as it goes before it breaks. Then tune all the strings down below it accordingly to the correct intervals. That sounds like a folly, but in fact, when you play on gut strings and you're used to them, you can actually feel the tension and you can hear the sound of what's called breaking pitch, which is the best sound a gut makes before it's about to break, which is well below that final point. That being said, there's only a certain thickness we can get gut down to, and we know the lengths of lutes from surviving lutes, and we have a very good idea that this is a common tuning that you see on my staff here. The Renaissance guitar is tuned likewise, like you see it in the next. It has only 4 pairs of strings. The top string is usually a tone higher than the lute or the vihuela. And then finally, the Baroque guitar, which you see down there at the bottom, is like the Renaissance guitar for the first 4 strings, except it is down a fourth in pitch. It's actually the tuning we have of the modern guitar. That being said, pitch was was a different standard back in the Baroque time, and we generally believe they used a half a step lower than we use today. That's called A415 hertz. It's a little complicated because in the Renaissance they used modern pitch that we use at 440. They also tuned up higher to 460 or 466 pitch, which is roughly a half a step higher. And we also know that in the early Baroque in Rome, they liked to use a low pitch, which was possibly a tone lower than the modern pitch. And in Venice, they used a higher pitch. If you go up to France, they might have used an A at 392 pitch. So it varies all over the place. To make things easy, though, we get to the 18th and the 19th, the 21st century, like we live in today, and we have the 6-string guitar tuned just like the Baroque guitar, except we get rid of all the double strings, and we add a 6th string at the bottom, and we tune all those lower notes to basses. I think you may have heard the Baroque guitar had lots of higher pitched lower strings. That's because that's what's called a re-entrant tuning. So you see the Baroque guitar goes E, and then B, and then G, and then D an octave higher, and then the 2 A's are an octave higher. So it has none of the bass strings that a modern guitar has. I hope that's clear. If your visitors are a little confused, they can rewatch this segment of this chat, and they certainly could take a photograph of this screen and look it up on Wikipedia or somewhere, and kind of, if they really want to get into tunings and pitch, we could talk about that all day. It's one of my favorite topics.
Wow, very interesting. Thank you. So a lot of good information there about the strings and tuning. This next question is actually one that I had as well. and just haven't had a chance to look up yet. So I'm excited to hear your expert explanation. But Candace asked, when we were talking about the lute, what is, and I think a few other instruments in the exhibit also had that same 90-degree angle on the neck of the instrument. Maybe what's the purpose of that, and then how obviously that's changed in modern guitars.
Wonderful question, because that is one of the most commonly asked questions I get after performing on the lute. One of the historical, kind of almost a cop-out answer is that that's just the way it's always been. If you have that instrument, the oud, which is in your collection, that is a very ancient form of the lute, and it followed tradition even when it was built in the 16th century, that it followed that form with the angled neck. Now, why was it angled to begin with? Couple practical reasons. If you have a group of players cramped together, the lute peg box coming back actually is more compact, and it allows people to play more easily. When I tune the instrument, I can reach the pegs much more easily in that configuration than not. It actually helps balance that rounded instrument very well on the back by having that counterweight to the instrument. It puts more pressure on the nut where the strings go over, to the point where it has a firmness of contact. The strings have a firmness of contact with that nut that they don't necessarily have when the neck goes out, and then the peg box is just a slight angle to that. I can tell you that because my Vihuela has exactly that problem, and I wish it was angled back. Now, there's one other very good reason, but it's practical from an engineering point of view. That neck angle is a very stable join. And I can attest to that because I've been at least on 1 or 2 airplane flights where that joint came loose during travel. And I continued to play and rehearse with my colleagues and didn't even know till the next day that the peg box was almost completely loose and just held together by the pressure of those strings. That would not happen on a guitar peg box, which I can guarantee you, if the joint came loose, it would just fly off like a rocket.
Very interesting.
Oh, and one more thing. Yeah. At some point, they decided they needed more length on the bass strings of the lute. And the way to do that was actually to build the peg box straight. I'm going to show you something. This is the result. You can see I'm as high as this lute. And this peg box goes straight out like that. And it was a very good idea to make these strings project more sound, but it does make for a more awkward instrument to carry around, and you need a station wagon for this. Anyway, the lute was not the point of this question and answer session. But I had to show that off.
Very interesting.
That is called an arch lute, and they were invented in the late 16th century as a solution to get more bass, to do better accompaniment for the new form of what we call opera today. The early form of opera, which required instruments and sounds that were much more dramatic than what they had available to them in most of the 16th century.
Yeah, it's so interesting you bring that up. So long ago that they were already thinking about bass and volume, because the whole, of course, we didn't get too far into this in your talk, but the whole second half of the guitar exhibit that we're hosting is about how once they kind of fine-tuned, no pun intended, some characteristics of the instrument, then it was all about making it louder as pop culture necessitated it being louder. And then we get into electric guitars, and that would be a whole nother talk.
The 16th and the 17th century had a very practical solution that always works. They just simply doubled, tripled, quadrupled the number of lute players at an occasion. And so we actually have account books where there were up to 40 lute players, 20 lute players, and guitarists, and everything all crammed together for some occasion. And it makes a big, wonderful sound, quite different than just electrifying one instrument.
I'm so glad you added that. That's really interesting. You mentioned the Vihuela a couple of times in our Q&A. And I know one of the questions that came through the chat was asking about the purpose of, they wrote the purpose of the 4 different holes on that instrument. And I will let you speak to that.
Yes. This is an easy one. If you look closely, there's actually only one hole, one sound hole. So I think that the person mistook, and it was evening the other day, and I had kind of darker chiaroscuro lighting. He might have mistaken these as sound holes. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving around. But in fact, those are just inlay decorations, which was a characteristic of the Vihuela. So sorry, there was only one hole. Some instruments did have more sound holes, and the larger the sound hole, the more it allows the instrument to kind of resonate its sound out of the body forth. I think there was also a question about the way the strings were wrapped up, and you see that here. That is just simply A, my messiness, and B, the fact that these strings, because they're prone to breakage, if they were to break down here, I've got lots of surplus that I can just keep pulling the string down. And I've had a situation recently with one of my instruments where it was breaking down at the bridge end, and I could keep reusing that string over and over again until I ran out of it at the top. So it doesn't look great, but boy, it makes my life easier.
Seems very practical. Let's see. Let's try to squeeze in a couple more. I know there were a couple different questions about the woods and materials used in some of the instruments that you were playing the other night.
Yeah, they're made of all different woods. The one thing that all the instruments have in common is that almost all of the soundboards are made of very fine spruce. Spruce, which is either alpine spruce, at least one or two of my instruments, the spruce is actually Sitka spruce, Engelmann spruce from Alaska. But for the most part, I have spruce that is from either the Alps or from the Baltic region. The rest of the instrument, though, can be either rosewood, maple, yew wood, varieties of ebony, more maple, lots of maple, but there are different types, and then the little inlays and the parts of the instrument will have bone, pear wood, plum wood for the bridges, which have to be very dense, but no ivory. I mean, although we know many instruments that survive today are ivory because they were valuable in their time and they were kept as exotic collectibles through the times. We have an unusual number of ivory instruments that survive, but they probably the workman's instrument, the warhorse instrument that musicians use, just didn't survive. They were more plain. Just like today, we all play non-fancy guitars, and they're often the ones that we're endeared to.
Very interesting. So one other question I know that came up. There's a couple comments about this. I know we very briefly showed the charango, which was the one made with the armadillo shell. And then next to that was the ukulele. And there was a couple different questions about kind of the origins, I guess, of the ukulele. One person asked if it is kind of stemmed from the Renaissance guitar and kind of Renaissance repertoire being able to be played on the ukulele. I know the exhibit talks about kind of in the early 1900s, people in the United States became kind of fascinated with Hawaiian culture after there was I believe it was called the Pan American, or there was an expo of some sort in San Francisco. And we became kind of obsessed with Hawaiian music at that time. But maybe speak a little bit to kind of the origins of the ukulele.
Yeah, so the ukulele does not have the same tuning as the Renaissance guitar, but absolutely it is the modern sort of living fossil version of what was the Renaissance guitar, that small little guitar that I played at one point. Before I played the Baroque guitar and after I played the Vihuela, I talked about the Renaissance guitar. Now, of course, in the Renaissance, they didn't call it the Renaissance guitar. It was the chitarrino, it was the little guitar. And now, from our 20th century sort of scholarly point of view, we look back on the history, we call that the Renaissance guitar of the 16th century. There are, I believe, 2 or 3 surviving Renaissance guitars from that entire period. And then those illustrations that I showed, from which we have enough information to make these reconstructions. Those instruments were so small and portable and practical that they were readily transported to all corners of the globe. By wherever a ship went, they would have probably brought along these instruments. You know, wherever a ship goes, there's probably music as well. There's a famous ship excavation in Portsmouth, England, of the Mary Rose, which was Henry VIII's ship, which was ostensibly outfitted for battle. It was overloaded with ammunitions and cannons, and it tipped over when a strong wind came. But lo and behold, when they excavated and brought up this the remains of the ship, there was a whole case filled with wooden musical instruments, which are really important to understand that period. The ukulele, the charango, all those instruments are variants of instruments that evolved from the 16th century, which were originally Renaissance guitars. And then they adapted variations in tuning for their various cultures that they were used in Mexico, for example, and in Hawaii, that are a little bit different, but somewhat related to the Renaissance guitar. You could play Renaissance music on a ukulele if you did a little bit of restringing and adjustment to it. I think it sounds much better, though, on a Renaissance guitar.
Very interesting. I can tell you've experimented with that before. We will, I was going to try to keep this to about 30 minutes. And I have one other question that I thought would be fun to ask. There was several folks commenting in the chat during the talk that they had just started playing, or they had picked, everybody kind of picked up a different hobby during the pandemic. Would you have any advice for those watching that are new to playing stringed instruments, or perhaps struggling to learn to play stringed instruments?
Absolutely. The guitar that I talked about, the guitar of 500 years ago until about 1800, is a very wide and rich history. So I don't mean to belittle what came after that. Of course, there's great music, but it's much, much more familiar to us. The music from the 19th century and forward, especially the 20th century. So if that's your thing, I'm probably not the person to instruct you where to go and learn that. But for everything earlier, that music is more accessible to us nowadays with the internet and with the universal exchange of sharing of information and ideas. When I grew up in high school wanting to play this stuff, I had to just get what I could find and mimeograph that music and listen to LPs and hope I could get sort of a better version of something. Now you can take, if you have to, you can take a modern guitar. You can play a lot of this music on a modern guitar and get a feeling of what the music is about. If you want to go farther, I suggest actually trying to obtain. I can give you some information about where to look for musical instruments. I do not recommend buying an instrument off eBay right away that's made in Pakistan. Those are floating around and usually give quite bad results. A lot of the music comes in tablature form, and tablature is a wonderful practical way to understand where you put your fingers and what to actually pluck to make the music happen. And that makes this music very accessible once you learn tablature. By the way, a lot of ukulele music is in tablature to begin with, so it's not that far off from our time to be able to read tablature of the Renaissance and the Baroque. Finally, if you just have any kind of passing interest in this, go and look on the internet. There's a huge amount on YouTube of great performances of lute music Baroque guitar music, Renaissance guitar, Vihuela, and you can listen to all the good, the bad, and the ugly that's out there and get a sense of it. But there's an excellent amount of great performances coming out and great performers today that have put their stuff out there. So yes, it's all for the taking, and this is a great time to kind of focus in on an interest like this. Finally, if I put a plug in, people should come and see your exhibit because they can already begin to appreciate it, especially if they linger on the earlier instruments that are in your show. As I said, the music is what attracts me to this whole period, but the instruments are very much a part of that, and the technique of playing them is what makes that music come alive. And there's so much variation in the use of the different instruments according to what country they're from and how they were composed on, and whether they were used and how they were used just for accompaniment, which is largely an unwritten tradition that we have to experiment with and make sense of.
Absolutely. And something that the exhibit really has taught me just in its first couple weeks is just all of the kind of geographic variations and cultural variations and impacts on the development of the guitar. So looking at those earlier sections, there's so much information about that. And then you get to the later sections of the exhibit and you get to just see neat things like a 3D printed guitar and just different materials and kind of experiments. So appreciate the plug for the exhibit. I was going to do that as well. I have one
more plug to put in, and that is it's currently completing its rehabilitation, its renovation, but just to the north of us in Vermilion, South Dakota, is one of the greatest musical instrument collections in the world. It's called the National Music Museum, and it's at the University of South Dakota, and it is considered to be one of the finest collections of stringed instruments anywhere in the world. People from Cremona, Italy have come all the way to South Dakota just to see certain instruments in their collection. One instrument besides the Matteo Sellas guitar that I showed in my presentation that I should call attention to is they have one of the very few intact extant guitars made by Antonio Stradivari. It's quite well known. It's maybe so well known that I didn't put it in my PowerPoint the other night because I thought, well, everybody knows that instrument. But it will open, I believe, next year or maybe later this year. So people should definitely visit the National Music Museum in Vermilion, South Dakota.
Yeah, that's definitely on my to-do list as well. I drive past that sign on the interstate saying they're doing renovations all the time. So excited to see that. Well, we will wrap up. I just want to say thank you again, Kenneth. The exhibit for those watching is here through April 25th. We are doing reserved time tickets, which you can check out on our website, which is www.durhammuseum.org. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you again, Kenneth.
If I can just quickly thank everybody for attending both the other night and then this talk right now. I hope you've learned from it. And I want to make a special shout out to all my friends who might have been tuned into this. Hello.
Yeah, I appreciate them as well. We had people from all over the country and all over the world, which was really neat. So wonderful. Well, thank you all. We will wrap up.